Welcome everybody, and thanks for participating today. I know it's a holiday week, and I know some of my clients chose to take today off instead of Wednesday, so the turnout is nice to see. And thanks to the County of Simcoe for putting this together and all the partners. I'm getting a ton of calls here in my practice about the things that we're talking about here today, so it's a great opportunity for people to get some questions answered without having to pick up the phone and call their lawyer. And I hope you get some real good value out of today. I know that I'll get a lot out of Sophie's presentation, and I hope that just by way of quick introduction, you'll probably hear me say it more than once today. We're kind of in the Wild West right now, right? In the 20 plus years that I've been practicing labor and employment law, both in human resources and labor relations and as a lawyer, we haven't seen the kind of circumstances that we're seeing right now. Be able to say, well, this is exactly the scenario, and this is exactly what happened in that previous scenario. It doesn't exist. So, we're taking educated guesses. We're doing our best to answer questions, certainly in the application of the Employment Standards Act and their recent amendments. It's our best guess is really what it is. So with that in mind, I hope that you'll all be a little bit lenient in terms of the answers, and keeping in mind, of course, that today is June the 29th and things are changing every day. So this doesn't constitute legal advice. I'm doing my best to answer your questions, and if you have further particular questions, please contact your lawyer and explain the personal circumstances, your unique circumstances, and they can answer your questions accordingly. Okay. So with that, I think we'll get right into the presentation. Three topics here that we're going to discuss. I just get my screen to advance here. There we go. We're going to talk about really quick maintaining safe workplaces, managing work refusals, certainly the current status of laws of constructive dismissal. My phone is quite busy with questions about that. And then the third topic there, managing and re-engaging absent employees. That's going to segue really nice into what Sophie's going to present, which is why that we've done them in the order that you see them there, and she'll take over and make up for all of my mistakes as we go. So for maintaining safe workplaces and managing work refusals, first of all, employers need to know that you have a general obligation to do all that's reasonable in the circumstances to provide a safe working environment for your employees. And that's everything reasonable in the circumstances, which of course can change in terms of the global pandemic. But the idea is that you'll do everything you possibly can to make sure that your employees are safe and at work. And further to that, my first point there on the slide is regarding employer obligations. There are a ton of workplace sector specific health and safety guidelines that are out there. If you go to the Government of Ontario website, there's a ton of them listed on there for your own unique workplace. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in terms of what you should or shouldn't do within any particular workplace. There's also some fantastic resources through the Economic Development Office there in Simcoe County through their website. So I would encourage you to go there as well and check out those resources. One thing to keep in mind is every guideline that you read, I believe everyone anyway, says, this isn't legal advice. So contact your lawyer, which is great, but it's a great place to start, right? It's a great place to start. And again, lawyers aren't public health officials. So we interpret those guidelines and we interpret your unique circumstances to try to figure out whether you should be adopting all or some of those guidelines given your unique circumstances. But again, that's a great place to start in terms of how you make sure you've got a safe workplace for your employees. Next thing for employers to consider, obviously, is job protected leaves of absence and accommodations under the Human Rights Code. Get up to speed on what your obligations are as an employer and when employees can be off or not off, what kind of documentation they have to provide for being off. Those are important considerations. The earlier you get your head around that stuff, the better it's going to be if and when the time comes that you need to rely upon it. Regarding protecting privacy, this is a balance, right? It's a balance between your obligation to provide a safe working environment and protecting the privacy interests of your employees. And when I say protecting privacy, there's going to be concerns. I'm sure there will be concerns in your workplaces. I know that I've already received calls about this. Employees are concerned about what their employer is doing with the info that they're collecting. For example, screening employees, employees who are advising employers of their own unique circumstances with respect to close contact with others potentially. If an employee is testing positive and they advise their employer of that, the employer has to know what obligation do they have to advise the rest of the employees in the workplace, and to what extent are they allowed to disclose information about that particular employee to others in the workplace. These are important considerations. Certainly for collecting information about employees, screening employees, protecting the information, how long will you hold the information for what uses will the information be kept, when will it be destroyed? These are all things for you to consider in your privacy policies. And again, this is a balance between protecting your employees' privacy interests and providing a safe working environment for the rest of your employees. There's no hard and fast answer to that. It's just something that you need to be aware of going forward, okay? Now if I move forward here. So regarding additional obligations, I've got a lot of questions about, well, that's fine, the employer has certain obligations. What about the employees? Well, first of all, the employer needs to make sure that their policies are accurate and up to date. If you have policies, new policies, for example, around, hygiene, physical distancing, how you move about your workplace, use of personal protective equipment, implement those policies for sure, but make sure your employees are properly trained on those policies, right? Once trained and once those policies are in place, it's now the employee's obligation to make sure that they abide by those policies, and they use everything properly, right? As far as personal protective equipment, they have to make sure that they use it all properly. It's not an option for them. If the employer says this is what's required in the workplace, then the employee must abide by those workplace procedures. Certainly, they should also advise an employer if there are others in the workplace that are not abiding by those procedures. And I think the rule of thumb is to try to educate your employees before you discipline or corrective action your employees. But employers must do so if they have employees in the workplace who are not following the protocols that are set forth by the employer. Disciplining employees up to the point of dismissal will be important to make sure that those protocols and procedures that you have in place are being taken seriously and that they're being enforced properly. So it's important for employers to know that. It's also important for employees to know the consequences of failure to abide by their workplace protocols, right? This is important for them to know as well. As far as communications go, a really good discussion, I imagine that Sophie will touch on this in her presentation, but a really good discussion with your employees about what they're required to disclose and what they're not required to disclose in terms of their own close contact with others potentially. Certainly if they're not feeling well themselves, do they have COVID-like symptoms, or are they just not feeling well? This is a communication process that has to be instituted from the moment your employees are coming back to work, and let them know what the expectations are. Certainly if they're not feeling well, and they have some symptoms that are associated with COVID-19, shortness of breath, fever, those types of symptoms, they should be advising their employer immediately. And if necessary, the employer needs to consider that situation, right, to know how they should act in the workplace. We'll get into more of that as we go. One last comment in terms of health and safety issues. Work refusals are a hot topic right now. And employers are asking a lot of questions about how do I manage work refusals. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, an employee does have a right to refuse work, as long as they have reasonable belief that the work is unsafe. Okay, it can't be some far-fetched belief, it has to be reasonable. But if the workplace situation is such that an employee believes reasonably that the work is unsafe, they do have the right to refuse that work. Now, it's not available if the work is inherent in the work that they perform. For example, if you are a healthcare practitioner and you're treating COVID positive patients, that's your job. You can't work refuse to refuse to treat COVID positive patients. That's your job, right? I probably didn't do a good job of explaining that, but I think you get the idea. So what's the right process to follow for a work refusal? If an employee declares that they believe that there's a situation in the workplace that's unsafe, Their job is to advise their supervisor or their employer right away. If you have a joint health and safety committee in place, the joint health and safety committee should be engaged as soon as possible. For workplaces less than 5, there's no need for a joint health and safety committee. Between 6 and 19 employees, the expectation is that the employees have one representative that they've selected from among themselves to be their voice in that process. And more than 20 employees in a workplace, you have to have a joint health and safety committee. If you don't have one and you have more than 20 employees, you should get one in place as soon as possible. And so you engage that joint health and safety committee right away. The first step in that process is the health and safety committee representative and the employer representative meet to try to resolve that issue right away. In the case of COVID-19, it's quite often the case that the employee is not in the workplace, right? They're at home and they don't want to come into work because they believe it's unsafe. But if they happen to be in the workplace, if it's perhaps in one department, for example, they have the obligation to stay at the workplace, right? They're not entitled to just go home and rest. If the employer can use them in another part of the workplace that's deemed safe, then they're to remain in the workplace and continue to work in accordance with their employer's instructions. And while this issue is being resolved, they stay at work. If it can be resolved internally and everybody can agree on what's required to make sure that everything's resolved, that the workplace is safe, then that's great. If it can't be resolved internally, then your next step is to contact the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor may attend on site to determine whether or not the workplace is safe. They may conduct a telephone inspection, which I've had a few clients have telephone inspections done. I can tell you that employers often are a little bit reluctant to get the Ministry of Labor involved. They don't like them snooping around in the workplace. I can tell you the last statistic that I've heard, and it might be more now, but I believe that there's been upwards of close to 300. 277 was the last count that I heard. 277 work refusals since the pandemic began, and I'm not sure that any have been upheld by the Ministry of Labor. I know it's an extremely small number if there have been, and I think the answer to that is the Ministry of Labor is being quite careful and quite lenient with employers who are really trying to do their best, right? They're trying to make the workplace safe. They're trying to accommodate their employees as best they can. And the Ministry of Labor is aware that this is not an easy time, and it appears that they're being quite lenient. So there may be certainly some instructions provided to an employer in terms of what they must do immediately, but work refusals typically are not being upheld, and that's probably a congratulations to employers out there who are doing a great job. So so that's what I've got for work refusals. Hopefully that answered your questions, and we'll move on to the next topic, which was current status of the law of constructive dismissals. This is interesting, and employers need to be aware of the recent amendments to the Employment Standards Act. So just before I get into that, what you need to know is a constructive dismissal is a unilateral change to a fundamental term of employment that is akin to dismissal, right? And I think most people understand that. If you haven't heard that language before, I could tell you that if you hire an employee to work for you and then you put them on temporary layoff due to a shortage of work, that's not why they were hired, right? They were hired to work, and you were to pay them. So certainly putting them on a temporary layoff where they're not working and you're not paying them is pretty obviously a possible constructive dismissal. So what you need to know, though, is under the Employment Standards Act, there are recent amendments to the Employment Standards Act, and you may have heard of these, you may not have, but if you've laid off employees, so there's been a reduction in your workplace because you weren't able to continue to operate at full capacity, or you were required to close because of government restrictions, and you put people on temporary layoff, there is a good argument that says unless it's permitted by the terms of the employment contract, the temporary layoff, unless it's permitted by the terms of the employment contract, then it's considered a constructive dismissal. Now, under the Employment Standards Act, our government has said if there has been a layoff or temporary layoff of employees, those employees are now deemed to be on an infectious disease emergency leave, okay? Which means those employees right now are no longer on a temporary layoff. They're actually on an authorized leave, and the leave will extend until 6 weeks after the state of emergency is declared over. So this is interesting because the leave that they're on right now is a job protected leave. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. But the other piece of that legislation, the regulation and the order that made that amendment, has also said that temporary changes, reduction in hours, reduction in wages, or a temporary layoff is not deemed to be a constructive dismissal. So under the Employment Standards Act, employees right now are precluded from claiming that they've been constructively dismissed, even though it's not expressly permitted by the terms of their employment contract. They can't complain that they've been constructively dismissed under the Employment Standards Act. But what employers need to know is it doesn't preclude them from commencing a civil action or an action at common law with respect to the exact same subject matter, right? It's possible for an employee to claim that a temporary layoff or a reduction in hours, reduction in wages in common law terms is still a constructive dismissal. And so there's a little bit of a interplay between those two employers need to be aware of. It's not an easy claim for them to bring in the middle of a pandemic, I must say, but they could bring a civil action for constructive dismissal resulting from a change in their working hours or their working conditions, reduction of hours, reduction of wages, okay? So just to loop back on the end of that period of time, right now I believe the state of emergency has been declared and extended until July the 15th. So 6 weeks from July the 15th by my math is August the 26th. And again, today's June the 29th. So employers need to stay on top of that. And they need to be aware that if the state of emergency is extended, then the period of a deemed infectious disease emergency leave, that period of time is also going to be extended for an additional 6 weeks. Okay, so stay on top of that and enjoy the press conferences that are put on by our premier, keeping everybody up to date in terms of the status of the state of emergency. Just a couple quick points on constructive dismissals. It's interesting, you know, it may be more difficult for an employee to be able to demonstrate that they've been constructively dismissed, especially when an employer is forced to close due to you know, government mandated closures. You know, courts, this is a guess. Most of the community that I'm speaking to, an employer side, Labor and Employment Council, are suggesting that courts will be much more lenient in favor of employers under that scenario, for good reasons, of course. But the other flip side of that is it's interesting, if an employee is able to claim constructive dismissal and they're successful in their claim, now there's a question about whether or not the damages that they've sustained might be greater than they would in normal circumstances, simply because it's not the easiest environment to find a job, right? So the reasonable notice period, as it's called, in terms of being able to find alternative employment, could very well be extended in the circumstances where there's a global pandemic and not very many people are hiring. So certainly that's something for you to keep in mind and keep aware of. Again, we don't really know the answer on that, but I expect that that's the case, that you could see an increase in awards of damages for employees who've been deemed to be constructively dismissed. Okay, last topic, and then we'll move over to Sophie. Sorry, Sophie, I think this is taking a little bit longer than I expected, but hopefully it reduces the number of questions that we're going to get later. Managing and re-engaging your employees. So I'm just going to touch on some of the legal aspects, and I know Sophie's going to talk about the human resources aspects, and in my opinion, quite honestly, probably the more important aspects, because I think if you manage your employees properly in advance, then you probably aren't as concerned about some of the legal requirements. That's my opinion. So again, in terms of recalling employees from layoff, I just talked about that. Technically speaking, they're not on a temporary layoff right now. Technically, they're on the infectious leave. Employers need to know this is a job protected leave. It's similar to any other leave that's provided by the Employment Standards Act, such as maternity leave, illness, disability leave. You know, so employees are entitled to return to the same position that they were in before they took the leave. And we've had lots of questions about that. Do I have to recall employees? Can I not recall them? Can I let them go? Can I hire others in their place? Can I have them come back to a job that's different than the one that they were in when they left? And the answer to that is no. And I would tell you there might be very limited circumstances. Certainly if their job no longer exists, then certainly you don't have to recall them. But there will be a presumption that their job does exist, and you may have to be prepared to defend your position if you don't recall all of your employees. Okay, that's important for employers to know. We'll get into the manner of recall here in a moment, but in terms of recalling employees, the manner of recall is quite important. You know, you need to be careful not just to do it procedurally properly. We also need to be aware that there are human rights obligations involved here as well, right? When you're looking at rehiring or re-engaging your employees, you can't re-engage or recall employees on the basis of anything related to age or disability. If you have an employee maybe who's prone to injury or has had recent absences or recent illnesses, you cannot take that information into consideration when you're deciding who to recall and who not to recall. The best practice is to recall in reverse order of the layoff. Do it in order of seniority. I know there's no obligation to do it in order of seniority, but if you do recall employees in some manner that's not seen to be objective, then you're gonna have to be prepared to justify those decisions, okay? In terms of actually conducting the recall, certainly a written recall is very important, a written recall notice. You're going to want to send that recall notice in writing and in a way that's you can prove that the employee has received the recall notice, especially if later on they don't come back to work when you expect them to. You're going to have to prove that they received the recall notice and they didn't return to work when you instructed them to. When you give them the recall notice, you have to give them a reasonable period of time to get their affairs in order. So consider employees, for example, who have childcare obligations. You can't send them a recall notice and ask them to be at work tomorrow, right? That's unfair. Certainly, you know, a week's notice should be plenty, but also be prepared for an employee to contact you and say, look, I'm prepared to come back to work, but I just can't come back to work in a week. I've got all these obligations. Be prepared to accommodate those employees, okay? That's going to be important. Certainly, if you have other employees to recall, you need them back sooner, then do so. But give your employees every reasonable opportunity to get their affairs in order before they're expected to come back to work. A refusal to come back, unless it's justified on other grounds, is a resignation, right? And so again, make sure that you've properly documented the receipt of the recall notice. And if employees refuse to come back, then it's a resignation. And I got to tell you, this is a question I've seen in the questions we received. It's not an option for an employee to stay at home on CERB. It's not their option, right? If an employer requires their employees to come back to work, they issue a recall notice. The employee refuses the recall notice without justification, then their employment has come to an end. You issue a new record of employment, and they're no longer entitled to CERB. Now, it might take a while for the government to catch up to them, but that's the risk that they take. And to be fair, the taxpayers shouldn't be covering employees who are on CERB when there's work readily available for them, right? So that's my soapbox. I've had that question too often, and it's getting on my nerves. So I'm sure we'll talk about that more as we go. But anyway, in terms of recalls and recall notices, that's the process to follow. When employees are coming back to work, your workplace policies, make sure they're up to date, make sure you have everything in place that you need. Hygiene practices, physical distancing, use of PPE, screening employees, screening customers or screening clients as they enter the workplace. These are all policies that you should have in place, practices that you need to make sure that your employees are aware of. Employees need to know what their obligations are if they're sick. If they're sick at work and they have COVID-like symptoms, they should go home immediately and instruct them to make sure that they get tested. They shouldn't come back to work until they've received confirmation that they are COVID negative, right? If they're at home and they're not feeling well with COVID symptoms, they should stay at home. And they should tell you they stay at home, and you should tell them to get a test. Testing is now readily available, and they should get a test done. If they're just not feeling well and they're not COVID-like symptoms, and you know, there's a little bit of overlap there, but a sore throat on its own, for example, may not be enough to justify them not being in the workplace, right? Or consider that they're able to maybe work from home, for example. Or you just monitor them in the workplace. Yeah, they got a sore throat, but you can closely monitor. They can isolate in the workplace so that they're away from other employees. And if it goes away in a day or two, they're probably fine. But these are case-by-case circumstances that you need to be aware of and be prepared to deal with. Certainly employees need to know what the consequences are for non-compliance with any of your policies. They need to know that their job is at risk if they refuse to wear masks when your policy is that they have to wear masks, right? If that's your policy, then they have to wear a mask, okay? Work from home policies, right? As employees are coming back to the workplace, if you require them to work from home for some portion of their work week, and you've never had to do that before, they've never done that before, you may need to change your workplace policies to allow for that, right? Certainly expense reimbursements for employees working from home. Is there things that they're entitled to that they wouldn't have been entitled to otherwise? Do you need to update your work policies? Absolutely. And further to that, the last bullet on the screen there is updating your employment contracts, right? Make sure your employment contracts permit temporary layoffs, and if they don't, then make sure that that's in place. And certainly, if your employees are working remotely, or if there's other changes in their working conditions, you'd like to make sure that you capture that in a new employment contract between yourself and the employee. There are circumstances under which you can do that, and you make sure you talk to your lawyer about getting that in place properly, okay? That's really the content of my presentation. I just wanted to make a note. If you have questions today and they're legal in nature and we don't get to them, by all means, don't hesitate. Send me an email. My email address is on there. We're doing our best to update our clients and our followers with regular updates on COVID-19. So feel free to have a look at our Facebook page and like it and follow it. And if you need to call, there's my phone number and our location obviously as well. But the last piece on managing employees there, I think the most important part of that presentation is about to come. And I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to hand this over to Sophie. If you're ready to go, Sophie, this is going to be over to you, and I will stop screen sharing, okay?
Okay. Carol, I'm not sure if you wanted to have any comments at this point.
Maybe just a reminder to people that if they do have specific questions that they feel are, outside of what's already being presented, to feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as possible at the end, and that we do have some pre-submitted questions that we'll be dealing with first.
Thanks, Carol. Okay, thank you, Tim. Yes, I think one of your comments that you made early on was about, when people don't do these things, or they don't do the things that I'm often working on with organizations about, is when they end up in your office. It's so much is about, how you do things, not what you do necessarily, right? So I'm going to just share my screen now. Can everybody see that all right? Good, okay. I just need to get back to my other screen. Just a moment here for a sec, sorry. Need to go there, okay. So we're still good, eh? Okay. And I just need to move a window down there. Okay. So today we're talking about, what I'm looking at is kind of the, re-engaging and engaging part of the topic today. And I'm calling it, there's a new term nowadays, it's EX, and it's about employee experience. And it's really that whole accumulation of a whole pile of things that happen in the workplace, everyday interactions that really dictate whether there's going to be engagement or no engagement. And I've got here that it's both an art and a science, and people often just say, well, just they don't quite say it in those terms, but they'd love to be able to say, just give me the prescription, and let's just make it go away. And let's make everything work. And unfortunately, we humans aren't that simple and that easy, right? And the other thing nowadays is that there's really a change, and I'm sure many of you noticed that there's a real shift in the workplace, right? And companies like Google and SAS have figured this out. We're not all as big as Google or SAS, but they figured out that it's really more about a collaborative and open employee-employer relationship. There's no more of this them and us that many of us they perhaps have lived through, have been part of, and still may be part of in some cases. So it's a real mind shift, I think, for some organizations, that it is very much about a collaborative workplace these days. So what we're going to talk about is this EX, or employee experience, the 3 environments of the experience, stress, and certainly a huge impact of stress is on for employee engagement, and the 7 areas of possible stress in your organization that you actually can do something about. So, and I'll talk more about stress in a moment. So let's now have a look at these 3 environments. So the first environment is technology. So do the people have, it's fairly simple, do the people have the right tools that they need to do the job? And now, there's a bit of, the tools may be changing. Do I need masks? Do I need a face shield? So there may be different other technology requirements or tool requirements than we had pre-COVID. The second one is the physical environment. So that's anything that can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, desks, not tasted, but chairs, arts, meals, everything, because some workplaces may provide meals. So, and here certainly the health unit, and I can't stress enough, besides your legal support, is looking to the resources from the health unit, as Tim said, from the province. There are a wealth of great resources. I know it can be very overwhelming. And Tim, partway through your presentation, it was kind of like, I'm getting stressed here. There's so much for employers to do now. And I can appreciate how difficult it is for so many employers. And the third part is that kind of elephant in the room part, the one that culture, your cultural environment is another component of engagement. And it's really, it's the traditional employment relationship, which kind of arguably has been successful for maybe about 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, can now be a hindrance in a climate of complexity and the accelerated change and uncertainty that we're in now. And with today's workforce expectations, they also are changing. So the landscape is changing. Many of you have questions about safe and healthy workplaces, much of which falls into the physical environment bucket. And there are many, as I said earlier, many resources that are available to you. And I believe that the County of Simcoe, if I'm not mistaken, was going to be sharing some resources with you as well, I think, after this follow-up from this workshop or from this presentation. So many are stressed today, too. That's the other thing in the culture, right? And it's, as employers, it's a whole new area that we've not had to often deal with. It's been okay, well, we have EAP for that. You call your EAP provider. But nowadays, with COVID, stress is becoming part of the employer conversation. And it's more about, for me, much more about that understanding your people, showing them you care. Can you change everything? Can you come up with a babysitter or childcare for their child? No, you can't. But you can certainly at least show them that you're compassionate or you understand their situation. And in some cases, they may have situations that you can do something about, right? But so the bottom line is talk to people. The elephant in the room is that people don't talk about things. They ignore them. It's going to go away. And they don't go away. They just get bigger. And I've been doing that in a virtual team meeting. It's actually talk to them one-on-one. It might be a phone call. For some people, it's going to work better as a phone call. People are pretty zoomed out these days. And so it might be a Zoom, depending on the employee, what works better for them. Is it Zoom? Is it a phone call? How are you doing? Hopefully you've been doing some of that throughout the whole COVID experience, the 100+ days that we've had. So you have to show an interest in the people as a person other than a person that is just doing something for you, that widget being created. So back in 2017, Morneau Chappelle did a survey and found that 70% reported that their workplace experience impacted their mental health. So if that was in 2017, I wonder where it is now. And that has a huge impact. How can somebody that's stressed be engaged in their workplace, right? Tim mentioned something about, not perhaps, don't consider not recalling an employee that perhaps has more workplace accidents. A great number of workplace accidents are the result of disengagement, which often is stress related in some way. So let's look at some of the areas that actually you have some control about, a fair bit of control in, and that you can address when it comes to stress. So the first one is the demands of the job. So it's important to have some challenging work, but demands shouldn't exceed an individual's skills and ability to cope. The workplace stress builds as demand and responsibilities increase, and when they're not in balance with that skills, with the ability and the time required to do a job well. And I think this is where some of the questions are coming now is, do I need to bring someone back? Maybe that there never was that good match for that demand, and time piece for that individual. Maybe they were or in a position that required more skills or greater ability than they had. Or maybe they didn't have enough time to do their job well. The second area is that effort versus reward balance. And that can be very subjective, I realize. But high effort without satisfying one's needs for reward is yet another stressor in the organization. So rewards can be, it's not all about the bigger paycheck or bonuses. It can be something recognition, saying to people, job well done goes a long way. And I would encourage you to learn to also connect and impact of that job well done, or whatever that verbal recognition is. When you connect that to some sort of verbal recognition, it really sticks more for that person and is much more meaningful. And if you don't believe me, try it. So it's not just, hey, Tim, that was a great presentation. It was, hey, Tim, that was a fantastic presentation. Your point on such and such now really caused me to reflect, and now I'm going to go back and do my homework on X. And now, how does that land with Tim? Right? So other things besides rewards, besides recognition, are helping others in the workplace, gaining knowledge in the workplace, opportunities for personal growth and professional growth. And of course, there is compensation. Number 3 is control. So that feeling of powerlessness is not one that any of us like. Right? So common complaints include things like too much responsibility with too little authority, right? Or feelings of not being heard. So the goal here is to have a balance between responsibilities and personal control. And so giving people authority that's commensurate. So many times I've been in some businesses where, and sometimes in retail, where I have to ask my manager. And I remember years ago being in a store, and I won't say which one, and I returned something and said, this elastic and whatever it was, it shouldn't have gone, a pair of shorts or something. And the employee that I was talking to didn't have to call a manager, was empowered to do that return and no questions asked. So how does that employee feel versus the one that always has to say, I have to ask my manager? Basically saying, you clearly don't have a brain. So why would you, we can't let you make these kind of really, really big decisions. So the next one, organizational change. there's going to be probably more of that now than there was even in the past. And I know organizational change is kind of an ongoing, nonstop. It feels like people are on this treadmill that just is never ending now. And I know there was pre-COVID, there was exhaustion in organizations. People just feel like I'm never there. I'm exhausted because it's always changing, and there's no time to rest. Well, there may be even more now, right? Or different. So, and change affects different people differently. Some people will be super stressed just at the mention of change. Well, others will embrace it and say, bring it on. Typically, change that we instigate ourselves, we're pretty keen on. But change that's being done to us, we're not so keen on. So, and change can be anything. It can be a change in people, in structure, in technology, in procedures, right? So and now procedures would include COVID health and safety procedures, right? Not everyone's going to buy into that. They're going to have to. We've heard that from Tim, but they're not necessarily going to embrace it. So manager or supervisor, the next area of stress in the organization. So it can be caused by lack of support from one's manager or supervisor, giving you a job with a deadline, for example. That's not necessarily a bad thing as long as you've negotiated the time and have the skills and the tools. But if any of those are missing, then there's stress, right? My manager was unreasonable. My manager just gave me one more thing to do without renegotiating all the other things that I have to do. How am I going to get it done? So there's, a fine balance there for managers to understand what's a reasonable expectation for time and to do a job well. And of course, it doesn't hurt when the person is passionate about what they're doing. And next one is social support. So this isn't about being social workers in the workplace, right? It's really an environment where there's support from colleagues and managers. That supportive environment where managers can provide clear and consistent information, coworkers are ready to assist when needed. People jump in. I'm sure you're either in those kind of workplaces or you've experienced those workplaces or noticed them. Wherever I go, I'm always noticing the culture in organizations and what are people doing. And it tells you so much about that organization. So basically, the social support's an environment that promotes positive working relationships and addresses unacceptable behavior, but promotes then productivity and employee engagement. Job security, I'm not going to go on about too much because that is, again, COVID has really put a lot of question marks there for people. But I think in Tim's presentation, there's a lot of information about, what you can assure. I think, the best thing you can do for your employees is give them some assurance. You necessarily don't know even where your business is headed in the next year. Many of us don't know where, but whatever you can give assurance goes a real long way with your employees, with anyone, with your customers, right? If your customers don't have faith in you, somehow you've not assured them that you're going to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. So job security nowadays is a big topic, and I think Tim covered that quite nicely. So I'm watching the clock here, and basically what I think the most important thing is talk to people like they're people. They're not a number in your organization. Have conversations one-on-one, understand them. Some of the things I'll address as well in the questions if we get to them, but it's understanding them. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach in managing people. It's definitely a customized approach. And what motivates and energizes and jazzes one employee and causes them to be engaged is not what works for the next one. So more importantly, in the future, when you're hiring, what you want to do is understand what your organization rewards and hire people that feel rewarded by that. That's when you get employee engagement. So, for example, if you're in a sales organization, you're going to hire people that are definitely motivated by financial reward. But if you're in a not-for-profit, you're not likely looking for somebody that's super motivated by financial reward. You're probably looking for someone that feels motivated in an environment where they feel that they're helping others. And so there's just an example of one difference of, getting that match. And it's really all about the culture match is, does the employee value what the organization rewards? And if they don't, there's the disconnect. So you've got 3 environments, you've got 7 areas of stress that you actually can do something about. And I would encourage you to explore that a bit more. Like Tim, I'm more than open to have you contact me. My email address is there, or call me if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Connect on LinkedIn. Also, for anyone that's on this, listening to this webinar, we have a stress quotient online survey tool, and you can have one complimentary survey done for someone in your organization, for yourself or someone in your organization, up until the middle of July. So you've got a few weeks to act on that. Just drop me an email or call me if you're interested, and I'll set you up with a link, and then I'll offer you a debrief of that as well. So can't thank you enough for paying attention today, and hopefully we've brought some value to you. So back over to Carol, our hostess.
Thanks, Sophie and Tim. So we're looking at about 3:51 right now. So if we end at 4, we've got about, just under 10 minutes for questions. And I have 8 questions that have been pre-submitted and through the chat altogether. We can go 10 minutes later for people that want to stay on if it seems like we're generating more questions as we go, because we do have the function that if you want to throw a question in chat, if we have time to get to it and it hasn't been covered, we certainly can. So I'm just going to thank our panelists once again. I think it was fantastic and very informative presentation, and we'll get on to the pre-submitted questions, and hopefully we can keep the answers as brief as possible so we can get to all of them. So the first question that I have, which is directed to Tim, is what can an employer do when a full-time employee refuses to come back to work because the employer can only offer reduced hours? And then a follow-up to that is, what is the best way to get over this transition while we hope for more business and more hours available for the staff that want to come back?
Yeah, great question. And it's a difficult one, and it's a real one for a lot of employers right now. And I should just say, I apologize to Sophie because I went way over on my time. I got carried away with trying to answer as many questions as I could in my presentation. So hopefully there's fewer questions for both of us now. And I got your comment too, Carol, about staying brief. So I promise I'll be brief in my answers. So the question is, if they were working 40 hours a week and you're bringing them back, but you can only offer them 25, tough situation, right? You know that right now employees are allowed to earn up to $1,000 a month without it affecting their CERB entitlement. I've also heard some comments recently in the legislature about a scaled approach to CERB, so that every dollar earned over and above the $1,000 would result in a 50-cent reduction from CERB. But I don't know if that's in place yet. I don't believe it is. So it's really about working together with your employee. They're not, the issue is now they're accepting a job that isn't the same as the one that they had when they left. And that's clearly because there isn't enough work. So the question now is, well, are they going to suggest that this is not a temporary function? This is a permanent function, and now it is a constructive dismissal, or it could be. What I would tell you to do is engage your employees, understand their situation as best you can. If an employee can't come back, they have childcare obligations, they have healthcare obligations with a mother or father or somebody who's elderly, and they certainly can't come back on reduced hours, then maybe you go to the next employee on the list, right? And you do your best as you can to reintegrate your employees as best you can, acknowledging their circumstances. If for some reason you go through your list and you still need employees, well, now you're in a tough spot, right? And you really have to recall your employees to be able to conduct your business, or there might not be a business for them to come back to. So I know that there were some other parts of that question that I touched on in the presentation. I hope that answers it as best I can.
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you. This question is for Sophie. What strategies to engage employees in adjusting and adhering to new strategies in a workplace around such things as physical distancing, use of PPE, or new physical distancing etiquette? And Sophie, I know you did touch on some of that in terms of finding the kinds of things that motivate each individual employee. So I don't know if you had anything else to add to that.
That's pretty, yeah, exactly, Carol. It's back to the organizational values, right? Do we care? Do we care about each other here, right? Do we have that social connection? We care about each other, and involve the employees in perhaps a conversation around, so how are we going to enforce this? What do we need to do so that we respect each other, right? This is about your coworkers. So the more you involve them in that conversation, not the logistics, the health and safety is the health and safety, right? But how you do it, and how you do it when you call people out. How are we going to call people out when they don't do that? Let them come into that conversation about how they want to do that. It's amazing what you'll come up with.
Great, all about communication.
Absolutely, thanks, Carol.
So this next question is for Tim, and then Sophie, if you do have anything to add afterwards, please feel free to jump in. How do you manage employees that do not follow COVID guidelines inside or outside the workplace?
Yeah, so I think I did touch on that. You hopefully can educate before you actually have to discipline employees, but you certainly have to enforce the safety measures that you put in place. So if you've got policies and procedures that require use of PPE and employees don't use it, then they're on the corrective action trail, just like if they smoke in a designated area or something along those lines. Inside the workplace, you certainly have some measure of control. Outside the workplace, not so much. If an employee goes someplace where maybe they weren't supposed to have traveled, for example, then you can certainly, out of concern for the health and safety of your other employees, you can require them to isolate or refrain from coming to the workplace until they've received a negative test. But in terms of controlling their behavior, controlling their actions outside the workplace, I think employers are from a legal standpoint anyway, a little bit in a tight spot. Perhaps, Sophie can suggest again on the employee engagement piece that, these employees should hopefully respect their coworkers, right? And voluntarily agree to conduct themselves properly.
Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, Tim, there is an obligation, right, on the employer's part, and it really becomes a performance management conversation. But it's how you have that conversation.
Sure.
It's, do you want to destroy that relationship with this employee, or is it one you want to salvage? And hopefully it's one you want to salvage. So have an emotionally intelligent conversation with that person, and you can have a emotionally intelligent performance management conversation. You don't start with questions with why. It puts people on the defensive right away. I'm sure lawyers use it all the time, right? But it's why puts people on the defensive. Address the behavior, not the person. It's not you are disrespectful. It's what I've observed, right? I'm noticing that you're not wearing your mask, or you're coming too close to customers or to your coworkers. That maybe leads me to believe that perhaps you're not respectful of their health, or what. I'm really confused. What is it, right? And listen. Don't think you have to do all the talking in a performance conversation. Listen. But you notice how when I said that, I was addressing the behavior I observed, then perhaps my assumption based on that behavior, but not labeling the person, saying you are disrespectful. It shuts the conversation down.
Great comment.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Sophie. Thank you.
Okay.
We had a couple of questions here that I'm just going to combine into one, because it kind of, they seem to be related. And I'm going to direct it to Tim first, and then if Sophie has anything to ask. It says, since recalling employees doesn't have to be based on seniority, my employer plans on bringing back the most productive and the most adaptable first, instead of who's worked here the longest, until we have a larger capacity before welcoming everyone back. How do you recommend we respond to staff when they inevitably ask us why some staff were welcomed back before then? And then the sort of correlating question to that is, from the employer's perspective, we are ready to recall staff, but would only like to bring back the top producers or find better performing staff. Can we just not hire back and start looking for better candidates?
Yeah, so the second part of that question was, can we just not hire back and start looking for better employees? The answer is no. It's job protected leave. They're entitled to come back. If you rehire somebody in their place, you're gonna find yourself in trouble. In terms of the recall and order of recall, you know, there's no obligation, certainly in a non-unionized workplace, there's no obligation to recall in order of seniority. I did touch on this on my presentation. I just think that employers need to be prepared to have those conversations if they don't hire back in some objectively reasonable manner, right? By length of service or by order of, you know, order of layoff, reverse order of layoff. Something that's easy to measure and obviously objective is the way to do it. Otherwise, you're going to potentially open yourself up to claims that, you know, I wasn't recalled quick enough because I'm 64 years old, and you'd rather hire back somebody who's 40 and can do a better job in a quicker amount of time. These are going to be tough situations. So. You know, I'm not saying that you can't do it. I think you need to be prepared to defend yourself. You need to consider what implications that might have on the workplace. You know, yeah, what implications might have in the workplace.
Okay, yeah, so basically put yourself in a defendable position.
Yeah, and do it respectfully, right?
Okay.
It was, Tim and I were on a panel earlier in COVID, and someone contacted me after and said, you know, I'm thinking of sending this email to my employees, and they're not called back yet, and send me a copy of the email. And it was very curt, it was very to the point, but there was no essence of, I really care about you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. I have one quick question that we received from our attendees. Tim, you talked about the health and safety committee.
Yep.
Health and safety committees. Would volunteers on site count towards the number of employees that trigger the necessity for a joint health and safety committee?
Right. My answer to that is no. My understanding is it's employees, workers, and volunteers are not included in that. Perfect.
Okay, that was an easy one. So we just have a couple more, if you can stay on for a few more minutes, that were submitted ahead of time. One, Sophie, I think you may have touched on, but I'll read it anyway. In the past, when we've given staff a raise or bonus, they seem more engaged for a while, but then it quickly wears off. Why is that?
So again, I think we're back to the values, right? And the motivators. We all have different motivators. I used to have a service business years ago, as I say, in a former life, and I had a bonus system, and I rejigged it. I would talk to my staff. They'd say, oh, it's not working now. No, I used to pay it monthly. No, we wanted weekly. So then I paid it weekly. It was more work. And you know, they were at the lower wage scale of the spectrum, and I wanted them to make as much as they could, but I wanted it to be some incentive. But it wears off, you know, there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we all need a certain amount of money to live in a certain way, or just to have basics in life. And then there's money as a motivator, right? And so salespeople even, it's been proven that once they get to 80% kind of where they feel would be so cool, they actually stop. That last 20%, they don't work as hard to get that last 20% of their pay. So even for people that are motivated by money,
right?
It's all different. It's different for different people, for sure. You send somebody on an educational conference. If I value learning and it's maybe specific to my job, and I really value learning things specific to my job, I'm excited and I'm the one that sits there and doodles through the whole thing or doesn't show up to the sessions. And a lot of us have seen those people or not seen them.
Yeah, I have just a follow-up question to that. Somebody has asked about, where you would suggest beginning and engaging staff. What one developmental activity would you recommend for supervisors and managers to help them engage their staff better?
Learn to have emotionally intelligent conversations. It will help you in every area of your life, not just as a manager or business owner or supervisor. Absolutely. It's the biggest payback.
And then the last question, I think you've just answered, what strategies to engage employees in adjusting and adhering to new strategies in a workplace around things such as physical distancing, use of PPE, or the new physical distancing etiquette? Same.
Yeah, so similar. Yeah, same conversation, and make them part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Like, nobody wants to have things done to them.
Okay, that's great. I'm just going to check the chat and see if there's anything else there. I don't believe there is. I want to thank people for hanging out a little bit longer than we planned. But what we're going to do is we're going to work with our experts and put together a frequently asked Q&A document that can be sent out to attendees. And hopefully that will just help remind everybody of the questions that we had here. And we encourage you that if you do have questions moving forward, I mean, we are here as a resource for you. So don't hesitate to email the CDC. I would just like to thank again my panelists for being so generous in answering those questions. And again, thank our partners, including the County of Simcoe and all our other partners that I listed off at the beginning, for helping us present this. We value your feedback. Watch for more Ask an Expert webinars, and everyone have a wonderful afternoon.